Right, so the South Africa has been in the global headlines for what has or can be seen for all of the wrong reasons. The looting of foreign-owned shops has this week spread to various parts of Gauteng, and the Institute of Race Relations says what is going on are the consequences of governance and economic failure. But to tell us more, we're joined in studio by Gabriel Crouse, who is an analyst at the IRR. Good to see you, Gabriel. Thanks very much for joining us.
Thank you.
So the IRR says the attacks and looting of foreign-owned shops are the direct cause of governance and economic failure. Perhaps you can elaborate on this for us.
Right. So academics have been using this phrase violent entrepreneurship for quite a few years in relation to these kinds of events. And basically the thought is that if you have a breakdown of the rule of law, if you have a criminal justice system, a police system that's not really enforcing the rules, bounds, values that our society is supposed to be underpinned by, then you end up having violent entrepreneurs. They're people who want to make money by robbing others, by harassing others, either taking their cash or taking their stock. And generally speaking, I mean, I've interviewed in the last couple of years about 60 foreign African business people working in the Central Business District and in Soweto, and I can't think of one of them who hasn't been hit, they like to say, in their time in SA. So we notice this now when you have a big sort of mob action, then it really catches headlines. But this is a daily event of a breakdown of law and order. They can't call the police, they can't rely on the police to protect them, and so they get robbed consistently and become targets for these violent entrepreneurs.
So if we talk to the attacks happening, is it only on foreign nationals or foreign immigrants, or is it happening to everybody across the floor, across the ground?
Right. So it's certainly the case that South Africa's lawlessness goes beyond just foreign nationals. Headlines this week, a lot of them have been about gender-based violence against women. Local South Africans get hit frequently too. Something that stands out about foreigners is that it's typically extremely difficult for them to open a bank account. Even if they do have the right papers, that's to say it's difficult for them to do so. And it's hard for them to get the right papers. There's a study that says it generally takes 6 visits to Home Affairs to get the right papers, 6 visits plus a bribe. And so that means they tend to be very cash heavy, and they're known to be cash heavy. And so they get repeatedly hit, because if you've got your cash in your pocket or your cash hidden under your mattress or your cash sitting in your store, then that's a very light way to carry a lot of value away from a person, for a criminal to get away with taking a lot of value.
So you look at the foreign nationals that have come here, and a lot of South Africans blame the foreign nationals of coming in and stealing jobs from the locals. Mm-hmm. That's always the story that we are hearing, and the complaints that are coming from locals. They say that foreign nationals will accept a cheaper rate, and they will not, of course, have to worry, because people say, we'll hire a foreigner, we can pay them much less. A South African, we're not going to have to pay that amount of money. Mm-hmm. And that in turn takes jobs away from the locals. What are you saying about that?
Right. So the South African Migration Project has been doing surveys about South Africans' attitudes towards foreigners, and they found that the majority of South Africans do take this line that foreigners are taking our jobs. They also found that the majority of South Africans take the line that foreigners are taking our RDP houses. Yeah. That's foreigners renting RDP houses, but it counts as taking. And also a majority say that foreigners are taking our women. That's women volunteering to marry foreigners and go out with foreigners, but it also counts as taking ours. So I think part of this has to do with the sort of South African idea of what is ours, which you can't really back up with good reason or logic. It's really quite outrageous. Mm-hmm. But in terms of the more robust economic argument, it does seem to me that foreigners are net job creators. That's because the majority of foreigners, particularly in the Central Business District, Alexandra and Soweto townships that have been hit, are entrepreneurs. They're self-starters. I did a case study of about 20 buildings in the CBD that were completely abandoned, that the infrastructure was completely falling apart, that had been sold between 1995 and 2005 for less than R1 million. And then, after being taken over by foreigners who made them safe, who did good business, who were selling curtains, selling sweets, selling plastic from China, they sort of made them work, and then were resold 10, 15 years later, in the last couple of years, for between 20 and R100 million. So that's real wealth creation. It looks like, in terms of exports, we managed to get somewhere in the region of 60 billion rands worth of exports going through foreign hands from sort of, they act as import exporters, buying from India and China, adding value, and then selling through to Uganda, Zambia, Congo, Kenya, and so on. And that adds to our balance of payments, that adds a surplus to our balance of payments, which is good for the rand, which is generally good for the economy, which is also kind of a net positive effect.
Yeah.
So I think the proper, robust way to think of them is as job creators, but also to bear in mind that a lot of this line of they're taking our jobs is coming from the same places. They're taking our women, they're taking our RDP houses.
You also, as the Institute of Race Relations, talk about the reckless comments that are made by leaders. And you point out, in particular, Herman Mashaba, as the Joburg mayor, he said foreign nationals are taking over the CBD, they're hijacking buildings. We've also heard comments coming from David Makura indicating that his administration intended to stop foreigners from operating particular types of businesses. How do these comments add to this narrative?
Well, they legitimize the sort of violent entrepreneurs that I was talking about at the start. They say to those guys, they signal to those guys, look, if you feel like making some money by doing violence against people in South Africa, choose foreigners. There are other kinds of comments that say choose someone else. For example, Julius Malema said we should redirect our anger not towards black foreigners, but rather towards white capitalists. And that, of course, legitimizes people who do land invasions and attack white people. Generally, what it does is scapegoat the government's own failure to provide a safe and secure environment for people to do business, to manage the borders. I mean, the Institute of Race Relations thinks the borders should be seriously managed. Since 2003, the Director General of Home Affairs said that the borders are, I quote, a joke. And they haven't really been improved since then. And that's its own kind of crisis. But what one ought to do is secure South Africa. What one ought not to do is legitimize violent entrepreneurs who one way or another want to get ahead in life by taking from others rather than by adding value through hard work.
So in a nutshell, what are you proposing as the Institute of Race Relations? I mean, what do you think is the solution here?
Well, what we really need to do is protect property rights and protect human rights. It must be much harder for people to steal. It must be much harder for people to loot. It must be much harder for people to illegally gain access to the country. It must be much harder for Home Affairs officials to extract bribes from foreigners. It must be much harder for police to extract bribes from foreigners or literally to just take their stuff and then resell it themselves. If you get all of that right, then we think the sort of net surplus value add that foreigners are creating and that make them beloved to many of their South African customers will shine through and overcome the sort of latent xenophobic tendency and the wanton and gratuitous violence that's literally setting our cities on fire.
All right, there we go. The opinion of the Institute of Race Relations, Gabriel Crouse, who is an analyst with them, saying the recent spates of xenophobia are the consequences of governance and economic failure. All right, we take a break. When we return, we go back to Cape Town to the World Economic Forum. It's day 2, and we'll get an update on what to expect today.